Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. We've got a lot to talk about this week with Fox News, the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News, um, and then a lot of coverage over that. And then you have the related topic of Tucker Carlson and the fact that Kevin McCarthy basically gave Carlson's show exclusive access to, I think it's almost like 50,000 hours of security camera footage of January 6th. And if you think about it, we know in this day and age, there's security cameras everywhere, right? I mean, I think about it sometimes like if it's a bad time to be a criminal, right? Like you can like maybe I think that especially in New York City, but like there's cameras everywhere, everywhere. You really maybe in your own home you've got to worry about your like Alexa devices and stuff like that. But if you're out and about in New York, and I suspect this is similar in most cities, and I don't know why it's terribly different in the denser part of most suburbs, there's just security cameras everywhere, 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 everywhere. And up on Capitol Hill, you can imagine that, given all the attention to security, all of the high profile protectees and politicians, it's no surprise that there's security cameras just everywhere. So if you figure even on a day, single day, or maybe, kind of how long did January 6th actually go? I guess it was, roughly 6 hours or something like that. Like the thing proper, I think it gets underway maybe a little before 2 p.m. or wait, maybe 1:30. I can't remember exactly when. It's funny. I remember we were actually recording this show when it started. I remember at some point I'll go back and look. But I remember the show we were recording that day. I think I had the TV coverage on, like on my computer, opened up as a window basically. And we didn't know January 6th was going to happen, but we knew there was going to be this, it'll be wild protest and everything, right? So we definitely didn't know that was going to happen, but we knew it was going to be kind of a bit of a crazy day. And I remember I saw the first examples of what were, briefly protesters knocking down the police barricade. And I remember, I think saying on, like on the podcast, like, oh, it's kind of, it's getting kind of crazy here. That's like, that's you don't see that. You see like, kind of rattling at the fences or something like that. But anyway, we saw it getting underway. So, as you know, McCarthy, as part of his the series of deals he has cut with the Freedom Caucus types in the House GOP caucus, agreed to give all this tape. So 50,000 hours. But again, as I was saying, even over 6 or 7 hours, when you got that many, when the place is just full of security cameras, you get a lot of video. So he did this, and I guess what was it? 2 nights ago, he did his kind of big, first big expose. And I kind of thought that, I mean, look, a lot of stuff happened that day. So I kind of figured you'd find some examples of a Capitol police officer kind of like maybe decking a protester. I mean, it was chaos. So um, if you wanted to get some shots out of context or something like that, how hard can it be? I mean, it was a total melee, right? And there actually was. I don't know who has seen this, but it showed up on social media. There's one clip. It's outside the Capitol complex, but there are outside, kind of right on the periphery of the building, there are a series of like terraces and kind of elevated patios. And there's an example of a insurrectionist slash protester climbing up one of the external stairways onto the um, it's sort of like it's railing, but it's stone. So I don't know what that's called exactly. Uh, there's police on the terrace, and he's kind of climbing and hiding, sort of hiding behind the railing and everything. And he gets in a tussle with his Capitol police officer, and it looks like the Capitol police officer basically pushes him off, and he falls off. And they said he fell 30 feet. It looks like he fell like 10 feet. But they're like attacking a building. I mean, it can get weird, right? So I thought it'd be stuff like that. But in fact, what we saw was examples where the insurrectionists were in the building, but not hitting anybody at that moment. And there were the famous QAnon shaman, the guy with the kind of Viking helmet and everything. I guess they had some video when Capitol police officers were leading him out, because remember, and this actually got a lot of negative attention at the time, when they first started clearing the place, they were just trying to get people out. They basically weren't arresting anybody. They just wanted to clear the space. And I remember at the time, a lot of people were really upset about this. Like, why are these people not being arrested? Why are they letting them leave? I think that was probably a wise idea. They were greatly outnumbered, and they wanted to clear the space. They really didn't have the personnel to arrest everybody, and they didn't want to get basically distracted in possibly being overpowered, but blah 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 blah. They're getting everybody out. Okay. So they showed the picture of kind of like leading the shaman guy out. And there was another picture of, this one insurrectionist guy, and there's like a knocked over lectern or maybe a chair. I didn't see quite what it was. And he comes over and he puts it right side back up. Right. So sort of like, they were it was a mess, and they were cleaning up. Right. Uh, a basic point, it's sort of like, what about the times that bin Laden didn't blow anything up? Right. I mean, it's again, you would have to be pretty um, gullible to be taken in by a few cherry picked images when a Capitol police officer was getting the better of a protester, and maybe it was rough or something like that. And look, I mean, I can't say there wasn't some moment where a Capitol police officer maybe went too far and hit someone when he shouldn't have, or something like that. But they didn't even come up with anything like that, or even that could be made to look that way. It was basically just, there were times when the insurrectionists were in the building but not attacking anybody, just walking by. So it was all pretty weak, and it's actually gotten um, I would say kind of a surprisingly negative reaction uh, from other Republicans. I mean, you had a number of House Republicans who immediately went on Twitter, basically like, "Okay, case closed. This was all fake news, and we need to release all those people." A TPM alum, Sahil Kapoor, went around. I don't know if they were all his quotes, but kind of put together a series of quotes from Senate Republicans, basically saying, that's bullshit. Like, we're not going to whitewash what happened here. So in any case, you have these two things. You have the Dominion lawsuit against Fox over all the big lie stuff that is still moving forward. And actually, just before we went on, I did a post about this because I read some commentary about this by the two media reporters at this new publication, Puck, which I actually subscribe to because there's a few people there who I really like, who do good stuff. But this was not good stuff, and media reporting generally is pretty weak. So in the process of discussing that, I made the point that uh, in addition to everything else about the big lie, it was really a perfect storm for Fox News, because Fox puts on deceptive, disingenuous, false stuff all the time. But for that to get you in court, you have to say it. You have to defame some particular entity. There has to be a person who is defamed. The woke mob cannot be defamed. Like American democracy cannot be defamed, or at least it cannot be defamed in a legally actionable way. It has to be some person or entity. And in addition to that, for that to have a lot of financial teeth to it, it probably has to be a business or a very wealthy person. Because what are your damages? You know, now in this case though, you have a big profitable company, Dominion, this election machine company, and they were clearly damaged by this. There's no question. I mean, good luck selling your Dominion machines in Alabama ever again, right? So they were damaged, and these texts and emails and everything and depositions that came out make pretty clear that all the people in authority at Fox knew these claims were false, and they were putting them on for months. And I think, there's often you see there can be a division about how other people in journalism react to this kind of stuff. And sometimes you see this division even within the same person. If you're in the media business, particularly if you're a publisher, if you're someone who has to make these kinds of decisions, you have to come up against this stuff all the time. How sure are we know that this is right, that what we're saying is accurate? What is our legal vulnerability, even if it is accurate? Blah 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 blah. So there's part of, I think, people in that business who say, wow, we sweat these kind of decisions all the time. When we're publishing stuff we know is accurate or have every reason to believe is accurate, that we've checked 10 different ways. To see a news organization repeatedly broadcast things they know are false is shocking. It's really shocking. In some ways, it's even more shocking to people in media. Because again, we sweat these decisions all the time. On the other hand, obviously, people in media have a really strong interest and self-interest in First Amendment law and robust First Amendment law, because they don't want to get put out of business themselves. So all that is unfolding, and you have this thing with Tucker Carlson come up with these videos, and among the many things it tells us is they're still in the same lying business. Nothing has changed. I almost wonder, what they're talking about now with the January 6th insurrection is not directly relevant to Dominion's lawsuit. It doesn't have anything to do with voting machines and all that kind of stuff. But I'm sort of curious whether stuff like this might come up at trial, because it sort of shows their continued impunity. They don't care. They haven't come back from the big lie stuff and say, wow, we need to clean house. We need to do better. This was pretty embarrassing. We need to turn a corner here. Of course not. Right? Even as the stuff is coming out, even as their texts and emails are coming out, it's the same old. They don't care. And that is the policy reason, one of the policy reasons for defamation law, that there should be some potential consequence for that kind of behavior. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about few other related issues. We're going to talk about this controversy over the DC crime bill, some unfolding stuff about oversight in the House and all those investigations and stuff like that, which actually kind of ties back to some of the stuff we've just been talking about. Before we do that, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. Grady's all-in-one cold brew kit makes 36 servings of gourmet New Orleans-style coffee for less than $1 a cup. Just add water, store it in your fridge for cold brewed iced coffee you'll want to sip all spring. And be sure to take some on your next vacation so you never have to worry about missing your morning brew. Ready to give it a swirl? Get 25% off your first order at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay, so Kate, what do you make of all of this Fox stuff going on? Am I right that the reaction to it has been it's been a little more negative than I would have anticipated? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the negativity of the Republican response, and more specifically the Senate Republican response, I think in some ways it has a lot to do with the fact that this is so politically baffling because I mean, what they're trying to do is obvious, right? Like Carl McCarthy through Carlson is trying to launder January 6th and uh this is Republicans started doing this kind of weeks after, making it out that these are tourists, but like that was an attempt for a good while, and then it just kind of didn't work because nobody in the world was buying it, so they moved on to kind of trying not to talk about it that much. And here we have a pivot back to that strategy. The end result is manufacturing a news cycle that's all about January 6th, which is exactly what most Republicans don't want to talk about because we just came off a historically weak midterm for them where a lot of the argument that Democrats made was premised on Republicans are too extreme. You need to pick us because Republicans are dangerous. And now we're back in another cycle where, you're having the clips that Carlson is trying to launder, which pretty much only remind people of the violent clips, and then you also have other people kind of countering the quote unquote peaceful clips with violent clips. So the end result of all this is just the airways being flooded with discussion about January 6th, Republicans' culpability in January 6th, and then on top of it, kind of the meta discussion of Fox News trying to kind of do this work for Republicans and McCarthy working with Carlson hand in hand. Because fundamentally, Republicans have yet to reckon with the reality that a good chunk of the party is pro insurrection at this point. So that's going to come up, particularly in the Republican primaries as we start to kind of gear up for 2024 more intensely.
Well, it's also and we shouldn't say it's not like Senate Republicans have been any kind of uh, paragons of virtue or bravery about this. That, as you say, they after some initial, maybe it was Antifa, maybe it wasn't so violent, blah 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 blah. They basically settled on that happened in the past. Let's not be dredging up the past. Of course it was bad, but don't be living in the past and don't try to politicize it. We all agree it was bad. Let's move on. Let's be done. And all of them voted against the voted against the committee, the Jan 6 committee and all that kind of stuff. So it's not that they've been covered themselves in any kind of glory. They've just kind of their battlement has been, let's move on. Yes, it was bad, but we're done. We're done talking about that. We're done. Don't politicize it. Don't whatever. And as you say, kind of right back to it. And it's kind of it's a bit funny because they can't let go of it. They can't let go of it.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm Democrats here, Senate Democrats, obviously you have control of the committees. Like, I would tee up hearings on this. I mean, this is also, in addition to being politically beneficial, it makes sense to have hearings on this, right? That you have what's with, just a few exceptions, been the most watched cable quote unquote news network of the past, you know, what couple decades at this point, is so transparently, like with the January 6th piece and with the text piece, working hand in glove with Republican operatives. And not just that, but to put things on TV that everyone involved knows is not true. It's hugely important. It's a huge contributor to the right wing march of the Republican Party and the threats to democracy that we're facing, on top of being pretty good for Democrats to keep hammering this stuff. So that would be my next move.
Well, it's also, and it's remarkable how much everything points back to this because this is, I think everybody knows this if you look closely, but it's worth sort of drawing out the point that this whole, weaponization sub quote unquote investigative committee that Jim Jordan is running in the House. If you actually, and we're gonna talk about that sort of, Democrats put together this like 300-page prebuttal, but if you look into that, most of it is actually trying to relitigate January 6th because like they have one guy. I did a post a couple days ago about this. One guy they focus on a lot is this quote unquote FBI whistleblower. But if you look at what got him sideways with his supervisors at the FBI, it's mainly that he was so pumped about January 6th and was so against doing anything to the to the people who were behind it. Like one of the things that came up was that there was this basically a cell of 3%ers, and 3%ers are it's not like a specific organization. It is a kind of it's basically a radical movement, a kind of an anti-government radical movement in the United States, heavily tied to political violence, kind of a violent ideology. A group of these guys were there on January 6th. They were being arrested, and the FBI, they wanted to arrest them with a SWAT team. And there's always a basic question of like, how much force do you use to execute an arrest? Very, very basic question. And in this case, he later said, well, the guy, one of the guys was saying he was willing to cooperate, and I think by that they don't mean like cooperate like turn evidence, but like turn himself in basically. But he didn't say that at the time. What he was saying at the time was like, hey man, this is being too hardcore. These are good guys. Why are you doing this? And also they're going to be they're going to have to face a totally biased DC jury. Now that kind of gives you a sense. I mean, first of all, commit your crimes in a location where you're ready to be put on trial. Like this is something that has come up in a lot of these cases where the insurrectionists will say, "Hey, I want my trial back in Arkansas where I'm from. Those are my peers." But that's not how it works. I mean, you can there are certain cases where you can ask for a change of venue, but the way it works is you go on trial where you did it, not where your friends live, not where you're from, where you did it. So in any case, the point is that a lot of their investigations, even when they're not explicitly about January 6th, go back to validating and saying January 6th was okay, or a few other of these whistleblowers. The reason they're whistleblowers is they were sanctioned because they were there on January 6th and not as law enforcement. They were there doing it. It's like all about They can't let it go.
Yeah. And then the text piece of this is just it's so comical because it is in that vein of like every damning thing that we potentially think, like, let's definitely put it in writing. Like these texts are so explicit. And then the one that got a lot of headlines, I think, in the past kind of 24 hours is Carlson saying that he really hates Trump, that within days they're not going to have to talk about him every night. It's going to rock. Can't wait. But it's all, all the coordination is right there. No one's like making any bones about it. It's you have Hannity, you have Ingram, you have Carlson kind of talking about like we have so much power here, and then you have Bartiromo texting with Steve Bannon and saying I'm not letting anyone call Biden the president elect. It just, and I guess where I come out on this is like, okay, so what, right? We have basically everything that we've known about Fox News for years. There's now just like substantiated proof that everyone involved was very comfortable kind of lying to their audience and like to who they call their base, um, in a way that will help, drive viewership and, you know, reward them financially, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I just think this is like a moment for Democrats to capitalize that I'm not sure they are doing to the full extent. I mean, we've had some like Schumer floor speeches and stuff, which is all well and good, but I I mean, I think there should be hearings. There should be Democrats should kind of be saying across the board, like, we're not gonna do interviews with Fox News anymore. I mean, honestly, I think it's suspect that they have up till this point, but I do appreciate at least the argument of like, this is how you reach this segment of the population, whatever. But it does feel like after all this, if it's just kind of business as usual and Peter Doocy gets to kind of heckle the press secretary and, Fox News gets to kind of not have to follow any of the rules, but still get all of the trappings of being a legitimate cable news outlet, it's like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, I do wonder because there's been, to your point, there have long been a lot of the prestige on-air journalism names at the other news organizations who, whenever Fox's sort of bona fides as a news organization are questioned, totally go to Fox's defense. And I have seen, I don't want to, some of them I know personally and are very touchy, so I'm not going to mention any names. But I have seen a lot of those people on Twitter in recent days kind of saying, how can you call this a news organization? Right? I mean, really kind of seeing it for what it is. So I do wonder whether that is, whether that dynamic is going to change. I don't know. I mean, there was one of the things that happened when Obama first came in 2009. I can't remember what they said they were going to do exactly. It wasn't. I'm pretty sure it wasn't like they were going to not. It wasn't like they were going to not let them like kick them out of the news pool. I think it was basically just that they were not going to treat them like a real news organization because they're not a real news organization. And the other reporters all really closed ranks behind Fox. And again, I don't remember exactly what they said they were going to do. I think it was more general. But there was that. And one thing that is come out is, um their defense has always been, that stuff at night, that's entertainment. That's like professional wrestling. But, kind of, what is it, like a mullet, like, all business in the front, party in the back kind of thing. But, our news organization, it's straight up, it's straight news, it's rock solid, all that kind of stuff. And the person, especially since Chris Wallace left, the person who was always pointed to is Brett Baer. As he may be personally conservative, but he's not. He's not Hannity. He's not Tucker Carlson. All that kind of stuff. He's a real news guy, and yet we now have this stuff, and this isn't stuff directly related to the Dominion stuff, but about this call of Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is leaked. There's a whole separate question of why is this leaked? Because I believe it was there's like a Zoom call as they're wrestling with, just to remind everybody, Fox, ironically, was the first and for a while the only network to call Arizona. And they were right, but it did stay close for a long time. I think it's not a matter of they were lucky. They were right. They just they called it first. This created a huge pushback from the Trump people, who were totally outraged. And so then there's this whole debate about, should we pull back the call, blah 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 blah. The New York Times, a couple days ago, they didn't publish a Zoom call, but basically they saw a contemporaneous Zoom call with all the top people, one of whom was Brett Baer, again, their straight news guy. And he's basically saying, yeah, let's we got to retract it. And not because it's too soon, just because our people are mad that
Right.
that Trump lost Arizona. So that really pierces that one remaining argument they have. And I'll be honest, I was even a little surprised that he went there, because at the time, contemporaneously, there was debate, like, did they call it too fast, right, among actual election watchers. Because again, when you call it, when a network calls a state, you're not saying, you know, it's more than likely that so and so is going to win. You're basically saying the other guy can't win. It's done. So it's a high standard. But so without this Zoom, that again, I think I'm right, the Times didn't, they didn't publish a Zoom, and I don't think, they didn't publish a transcript, but they saw it. It would be one thing if they were kind of saying, hey, they're still counting. It's too soon. We made an error here. But that was not the nature of the conversation at all. It's, our people are upset and Trump's upset. So I think there was actually, I don't know if it was Baer, but like part of the debate was, we should just give it to Trump. And I mean, through a different reasoning, there may have been some argument of kind of like, we were too soon saying it was over. But there was never any reason to give it to Trump. That's just absurd, unless you're just trying to please Trump and his people.
Yeah, and going back to that point you made about how Fox has always kind of bafflingly benefited from the warm embrace of the other, cable networks and kind of the major outlets. A thing that I've always found so weird is, like, on the one hand, you're like, okay, they're probably friends with these people, right? But you're being asked this question in a professional capacity, right? And you should be mad that Fox News is given the same treatment as a legitimate news outlet, because, like you kind of alluded to at the top, journalism's really hard, and making sure you're right about stuff takes a lot of work. And especially when, if you're a cable news person, you're directly competing with Fox, a place that does not have to go through those rigors to try to check that things are right. A place where maybe there'll be kind of an off the cuff, like, by the way, that wasn't quite true, like 4 days later, after many night primetime segments have been devoted to whatever the issue is, and it'll be tossed into like the five, right? And then just
Right.
moved right along. Yeah, but it's just, it's like you said, the other piece of it is always pointing to the quote unquote legitimate journalists who work there, as, I don't know, an excuse or like some kind of putting a facade on the situation. But like you say, you have the Bear thing, you have John Roberts, who's like the kind of big White House correspondent. There's also an email from him in the court filings where he's saying, we're getting a lot of heat from our people on Arizona, kind of thing. And it's just like, we've always known what this is, and now any kind of plausible deniability is just gone. And so I really hope that Democrats kind of like take this moment to explore how deeply corrosive Fox News has been to the democracy. And I worry, based on the reaction so far, that it's just going to be what they always kind of do, which is like give it this weird beltway-ish benefit of the doubt, where it's kind of like, yeah, we know, but what can you do? It's like, well, you can do some stuff, you can kind of extend this news cycle, which is making Fox News just look so bad at the very least.
Well, I would say I agree with that. I would also say for Democrats, I think even more important, because there's no, Fox News will not be on the ballot in 2024. It may be indirectly on the ballot in some esoteric sense, but it will not be up for election. It's a private company. However, Republicans will be up for election, and they are, it's it's sort of reminiscent. I was just thinking about this before we started the show today. It's a bit reminiscent of the 2012 presidential campaign. Now, as we know, the Republican nominee in 2012 was Mitt Romney, who is now treated almost as an honorary Democrat by some people, certainly by a lot of Republicans.
Hmm.
And in fact, relative to what came after, certainly on the cultural stuff, he's a relatively moderate guy. I mean, again, everything sort of changed afterwards, when you compare him to Trump. But he to try to win that election, kind of went there on a lot of immigration stuff, got into what was the sort of catchphrase of the moment, which was getting immigrants to self-deport, which was basically a euphemism for making things so hellish that people would just flee the country, basically. In any case, after the 2020 after the 2012 election, there was this big thing where they did a quote unquote post-mortem, the RNC did, and there was this kind of collective sense of, we've got to shift. This is not 1950s America. It's a diverse country. All this kind of, this general, we were wrong. And the upshot of that, the sort of the most concrete policy implication of that, was we have to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And that was going to be the thing that made Marco Rubio's career. He was going to usher that through the Senate and, get the House to agree and blah, 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 blah. As we know, that lasted about 6 months, and that bill never got passed. And what ended up happening was the GOP ended up doubling down on that kind of politics. Now, to be clear, one of the uh, one of the upshots was it worked for them. It actually worked for them pretty well in a lot of ways. One of the ideas coming out of the 2012 campaign was, and it was frequently put this way, there aren't enough more white voters for Republicans to get. There's just not enough of them. They've kind of maxed it out. Now, one of the lessons of 2014 and 2016 and until today is actually there were a lot more white voters out there, and that gets all complex and everything. But in any case, what I really take from it is, much as the post-mortem didn't pan out, Republicans can't move on from January 6th. It frequently gets talked about as, Democrats, they can't get over it. They can't move on, man. That was like, 2 years ago now, more than 2 years ago. Move on. It's done. You can't keep talking about the same thing. But really, it's Republicans who can't let it go. They keep going back to it. And I really think that, when you see all these Republicans now coming forward and saying, yeah, let them out. Let's pardon these guys. And Trump's fully behind it. I think it's important for Democrats just to kind of just to keep a notebook of all these quotes, because these are 30-second ads, and it's true that the people who make the most outrageous comments are usually people who are in relatively safe districts, but who cares? you know it's one party. This is what they're for. So you really need to remind people. So if anything, it's sort of an opportunity for Democrats just to remind everybody, this is who Republicans are.
Totally. Also, Republicans have been pretty comfortable tarring the Democratic Party with the brush of, you know, like student groups at Oberlin or like far left activists, and then just deciding that's the platform of the Democratic Party for ages. So I don't think it's like that unconscionable for Democrats to take the positions of fringier Republicans and say that is the party's position.
Well, and also kind of like the reason Jim Jordan is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee is because of Republican congressmen from New York. right? So it's not just kind of like,
Totally.
politics ain't beanbag. It really is connected
Yeah.
because it's one caucus. They
Right.
they they support each other.
So, while we're kind of talking about these committees, you know, something that we've both noticed is the aggressiveness that ranking House Democrats are bringing to the shenanigans of the Republican chairs, primarily on these kind of the big investigatory committees, which is, oversight and judiciary. Um, and you talked about Jim Jordan on judiciary and how Democrats kind of put out that 300-page pre-buttal. um, and there's a similar dynamic going on in oversight, which is James Comer is the chair and Jamie Raskin is the ranking member. And last night, Comer sent, he's all they kind of do sometimes is send letters, right? So that friendly outlets will write up their letter and they can go on Fox News and talk about the letter. And so Comer sent a letter last night, um, basically trying to bolster his argument that the DOJ and the National Archives treated the discovery of classified documents at Trump's places and at Biden's places diametrically differently, and then that's existential proof of the bias within those departments. And his newest kind of data point is that the general counsel for the archives said that when the first report came out about documents found at the Penn Biden Center, that the archives had drafted a statement in response that they ultimately didn't send. And Comer is juxtaposing that with the archives releasing a statement in response to one of the earliest stories about the Mar-a-Lago documents. And then Raskin responds by putting out this whole kind of detailed memo and then sharing this letter from the Department of Justice, never before disclosed, where the DOJ basically says we asked the archives to can it while we're doing our investigations, right? Like we're trying to keep things kind of clean and pristine and just zip it while we're figuring out what's what. Like you don't really need to be in a rush to give outlets your statement in response kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, but what's interesting about that is it feels like a marked departure from how Democrats used to react to this kind of stuff, which is just so clearly kind of playing to the Fox News viewers at home and has very little bearing in reality, or at the very least is so spun into something a lot larger than it is, which is kind of like the hand waving, the, oh, well, they're just making that up. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about whatever, healthcare, blah, 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 that kind of technique. And now they're switching tacks. Now it's very like, no, we're going to talk about this and we're going to disprove what you said kind of point by point, which is interesting because that's something that I don't think anyone is like, oh, well, this will convince the Fox News people who will get really riled up about these kind of like minor characters in the
Right,
drama.
right, right, right.
But it is a way for them to kind of quote unquote work the refs a little bit, because all so much of congressional coverage is about conflict. So it's not just kind of the Fox News jabs, blah blah blah. Now it's about the fight, which means that that Democrats are getting their stuff in there too, right? Like, and then they can go on TV and kind of talk about how it's not real. And it is this whole new sense of aggressiveness that I think, one of our editors, David Kurtz, had this idea, which I think is probably right, that a lot of it feels like it stems from the impeachment proceedings, that you had a lot of Democrats who have since kind of risen to positions of prominence in the party, specifically on the House side, who were impeachment managers, or that was part of their job, kind of putting together this cohesive narrative, figuring out how to debunk stuff in a way that's not boring and in a way
Yeah.
that gets attention. And now you have those same people, kind of on these various committees and who are taking nothing sitting down and not doing any of the kind of, well, let's just sweep that under the rug, like that's stupid to talk about, but just kind of confronting Republicans head on and trying to snatch back the narrative of those conversations.
Yeah, it's funny because it's certainly not that people like you and I, Kate, or kind of almost anybody who is not a hardcore conservative and just follows national political news, it's not like people were saying like, "Yeah, Jim Jordan, if he says he's got the goods, he's got the goods,"
Right.
right? I mean, it's not like anybody thought that, and yet these things can sort of drone on, and the way that like the Benghazi hearings and the hearings about liberal bias at the IRS and all these kind of things, and people can know they are sort of spun up and BS and all that kind of stuff. And yet they can still take a toll, and people get to, there are subpoenas for all these people at different agencies and all this kind of stuff. And what I was struck by when that 300 plus page report, kind of prebuttal, whatever you want to call it, came out, it was, I almost don't want to say damning, because damning gives the whole thing more sort of solemnity. It was like hilarious. They're kind of like, well, these three FBI whistleblowers, what were they? What were they? How were they weaponized against? Well, they were there on January 6th, like as they're kind of being part of the insurrection. So kind of like you know. Uh, were they mistreated? Is that okay that federal law enforcement can be there with the lawbreakers? And this thing about this one guy that I mentioned, you look through it and just case after case of sort of middling level, um, uh, him just breaking FBI rules and doing stuff he's not supposed to do. Uh, you know, using his friendship with Jim Jordan to hawk a book, to run a fundraiser for himself. And like one example, and this is everybody kind of zoomed in on this. There's been this whole thing about the Biden DOJ, kind of weaponizing the government against parents and school boards and all that kind of stuff, right? Saying parents are terrorists and all this kind of stuff. So one of the things he had that he wanted to talk about was that he was sent to surveil someone at a school board meeting. Well, okay, that sounds pretty bad. FBI agent, someone there is to talk about masks or something, and the FBI. Well, it turns out he was there because there's this 3%er guy, basically a guy who there's a terrorist investigation into. So you put all this together, and I think it kind of, in one fell swoop, now kind of whenever they talk about their hearings, their weaponization hearings, the kinds of reporters that usually are like kind of like, if you talk to them, they kind of know Jim Jordan's full of it, but they got to go through the motions, right? Okay, we're going to have a hearing. Now everybody's just like laughing. It just kind of made a joke out of them. And that is different, even though kind of everybody probably knew it was going to be a joke. It just kind of it just sort of wrong-footed them in this basic way, that each time they announce someone, a lot of the people in DC who are kind of, as you say, they're the refs, are kind of like, what? Here's the page on that dude. It turns out this guy is like a complete liar, and it was pretty effective, and it's just a different thing.
Totally. And I think it also removes some of the unjustified gravitas that these guys have just from being chair. Like you'll have James Comer will have like a blow up, thing of like Hunter Biden, everything he's done badly since birth. And then he'll be like, this isn't about his family. This is about Joe Biden. This is about the president. And that kind of stuff, not that it was taken credulously, because I think, like you say, everyone kind of knows who these guys are, but it does give them easier entree into like kind of mainstream news, right? Because they're like controlling these powerful committees. So it's kind of, if oversight chairman says or does something that elevates
It's
the
news.
newsworthy level.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
And so having these kind of point by point rebuttals also just kind of, like you say, it makes them look silly because they can't get away with any more just kind of giving the top lines and saying like this is a serious problem we want to look into, because now Democrats are like, well, actually it's not serious, it's stupid, and you're making a lot of it up, and here is exactly how that's happening.
Well, it's funny. There's actually I saw Jesse Waters, who used to be like, he started out as Bill O'Reilly's like muscle, right? The guy who if he wanted to go harass someone and like, send someone to take a camera over to take a picture of this person when they're getting into their car and like spit on him or
Mhm.
something, that was Jesse Waters, and now he's got his own show. In any case, I saw a segment with him where he's basically, what's going on? You've been there for 2 months, House Republicans. Where's the hearings? What's going on? And they're kind of getting it from both sides now, where Republicans want to see the, want to see them use these chairmanships and their subpoenas and all this kind of stuff. Um, and you've got more aggressive Democrats, as we've discussed. The other thing though too is, and this I think is going to become a bigger issue, is there are a lot of Republicans who kind of like, let's stop talking about January 6th and how it was awesome. Like, we're happy to kind of cover it up and say it's, never talk about it again. But again, a lot of these things they want to investigate are basically just about vindicating January 6th. And Republicans who are not in like, Republican plus 30 districts, they want to be done with that. I mean,
Mhm.
it kind of goes back to that 2012 analogy I was making before, of sort of like, what are we, like 5 months on from November, right? When kind of everybody, when it was sort of universally recognized, kind of like, all right, maybe the Blake Masters thing, that's not really the future, you know, kind of these like feral incel gun nuts. Like, people don't like that, right?
Mhm.
But they're just right back to it. They can't help it.
So before we wrap up, let's do a little corner on this DC crime bill that is just so shrouded in stupidity. But I guess, okay, from the beginning. So the DC Council, uh, the City Council passed this bill, which essentially the point of it is to modernize a lot of the city's crime code, which hasn't been meaningfully touched since like 1901. And a lot of places have done this with their codes. You just kind of have to update um, old vague uses of language and consistencies. In this case, a lot of the effort was about breaking broad categories of crimes into more specific categories and then clarifying what appropriate sentences are for those kind of different um, levels of that crime. Things kind of like grand larceny versus pickpocketing, the use of weapons. Does anyone get hurt? That kind of stuff. And so, in some, in the way that this has been just kind of sold and accepted, including by Democrats on the Hill and by Joe Biden, is that this is a soft on crime bill that lowers sentences and is going to make DC less safe. And just literally the text of the bill, that's really not what's happening at all. And the example we keep hearing over and over is the carjacking piece, because carjackings are up in DC. But what it does is it's just trying to kind of move sentencing guidelines to be where judges are actually giving out those sentences. So basically, with like the most egregious carjackings, judges are giving out 15 years in prison. And this is moving that, the sentencing recommendation down to 24 years. So it's not like, is it moving it down from 40? Yeah, but no one's saying like people should be in jail for 5 minutes for this crime, right? I mean, it's multiple decades. Um,
So what does like the white, I mean, because I was not really following this until the president put out word basically that he wouldn't veto it.
mhm.
Um, what are they pointing to? What, I mean, it can't be Can it really be as trivial as what you're describing?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, the council passes this, the mayor vetoes it, and she says she agrees with 95% of the bill and doesn't agree with the 5%. And to be honest, like that 5% is all that's being spun. So I think there is an argument here for maybe like this is a good bill, take out the objectionable parts or the spinnable parts and kind of move right along. Right. But anyway, she vetoes it. The council overrides her veto. And then House Republicans kind of get their hands on it. And I think part of why national Democrats were so utterly bamboozled by this and kind of willing to accept that this is just a soft on crime package is that the pushback from, kind of local Democrats and the people who worked on this bill. And by the way, this bill is a product of like really intensive study involving kind of, a panel with like experts and lawmakers and representatives from all the different law enforcement offices in DC and everything. But the pushback was all, you don't respect DC statehood, you don't respect our right to self-govern. This is racist, this is paternal, like all that kind of stuff, which is true, but there was almost no litigation over the content of the bill, which just let the way Republicans were spinning it become, for all intents and purposes, what the bill was. And so then when the way that it works for Congress to kind of bat down DC legislation is the filibuster goes away. So it's just simple majority in the Senate. And obviously, you have someone like Joe Manchin who's going to buy whatever bill of goods Republicans are selling him. And the Biden decision to knock or to not, block, it's like so many negatives here, but the Biden decision to basically allow Congress to block this city legislation came as a big surprise to a lot of Democrats, and especially a lot of House Democrats who are super pissed about it. Um, and and that's basically where we are now. Like, there's a lot of kind of anger. There's a lot of incoherence, to be honest, in the White House's statement, because it's kind of hard to go pretty aggressively on, I think DC should have the right to self-govern, except when I don't like what they're doing. That's not exactly a rock solid stance to take.
Right.
So now, basically, where it is now is the chairman of the council is saying, like, well, I'm going to retract the legislation. But Hill Republicans are like, no, we're going to keep doing this because they love it, right? It's so good for them to be like, DC is lawless and we're trying to, impose order.
Right.
And now I think the concerning thing is Democrats just kind of handled this so badly that it really, I think, incentivizes House Republicans in particular to keep going this route, knowing that that's kind of like fertile ground. And I don't think anything like this would ever get through Congress, but Republicans have long said, they want to ban abortion in DC and basically every other liberal policy they don't like. So, I mean, that big kind of shooting self in foot mess is where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, I- it- the thing that comes through most clearly to me is a lot of us just believe that DC should be a state, and that the federal government shouldn't be able to overrule, all the reasons why DC should be a state. I mean, I can sort of see the argument. Look, as long as it's not a state and you do have a say, then you have a policy question. But it's at best, it creates some level of cognitive dissonance. There's no question about that. And whatever, I don't know the particulars of this bill. I mean, it does seem, I am curious why the mayor vetoed it. The mayor is the one citywide official, or the one citywide official who can speak to this. I would guess that um, it it does not. It would not surprise anybody that Joe Biden does not want to go into the 2024 election with any kind of anything that can be kind of portrayed as soft on crime with his fingerprints anywhere on it. And it's funny too, because a lot of uh, a lot of or well, DC is complicated from a law enforcement point of view, since a lot of it is actually federal, and it's very complicated in terms of who prosecutes and what laws different things are under and all that kind of stuff. Certainly, you should not, at a minimum, you should not be in a case where um, a lot of senators, and not even like, just Bernie Sanders or someone like that, or just like the hardcore liberals, are sort of like, hey, what the fuck happened here? I think I saw like Dick Durbin, and like Dick Durbin, I'm used to, like, kind of his major constituency is the producers of Meet the Press, right? And so if he's upset about it, or I don't know, it is certainly basic blocking and tackling. Don't surprise your own caucuses. Make sure everybody's on the same page about where you're going with this. I do wonder. I don't know. Sometimes it we always need to remember that even people charged with the most grave responsibilities sometimes just screw up. And I don't mean screw up here in the sense of the policy decision they're making. I mean screw up and kind of like, oh, we forgot to tell Chuck Schumer sorry. Something like that. And some of that may be like, hey, we're working on Ukraine, and we're trying to deal with inflation. This kind of, this, we just didn't have our eye on the ball. I have no idea. I have, again, I only, this really, you obviously live in DC now. This only really kind of came onto my radar when the White House made clear it wasn't going to veto it. That's one of the
Right.
first I heard.
I mean, and then the deeper part of this that I find to be a bummer is like what you're saying, that, Biden is going to run hands up screaming from anything that makes him soft on crime before 2024. But it is like kind of profoundly depressing how successful Republicans continue to be with that issue, and how it's not very important at all that the tough on crime stuff is connected to any factual underpinning. And we've talked about this before. In some ways, it's because is crime up or down is kind of a harder question to answer than it would seem. And there's a lot of different kinds of crime. I think there's also the piece that safety is something that is so subjective, that if people have had a bad experience personally, it's really, really hard to convince them that the city is not increasingly dangerous across the board. I think obviously there's the race piece and the piece that demonizing cities as lawless hellholes does a ton of work for Republicans and the right wing ecosystem. And then on top of that, I don't know if you saw, but Ashley Parker at the Washington Post retweeted the Washington Post editorial board's piece on this and said, crime in DC is out of control. It's crazy that this even has to be said, kind of thing. And it's like, well, it's not really. And most of the major, the kind of biggest, scariest crimes rates are down, and down from last year, which was down from the year before. But it's just such a mess. And it's an area where Democrats really just resist not playing by the Republican rules there. And so that's why I think the idea of like lower sentencing is so scary for them, and something they absolutely do not want to be attached to, despite the fact that we've tried kind of maximal sentencing and punishment for decades. And we've seen all the harm that results from that. And I thought that after Fetterman's campaign, we might see a shift here, because we finally had kind of a big, prominent Democrat who ran in, a not easy state, who did crime in a really different way. He focused on, obviously marijuana was his big kind of entry point for the over punitiveness argument, but then he hired the people who had gotten out of prison to his staff, and when they went after him for that, he wasn't apologetic, right? He just very much like kind of stuck to that idea of, he just wasn't married to the idea that punitiveness is the only response to crime. And I thought that might kind of give Democrats a little entryway to at least experiment with different responses to this stuff, especially while we're still, far out from 2024. But, that was not the case with this instance.
I will say this, and this is why I've said for many years, progressives and liberals are the ones who have the greatest interest in public safety, because any rise in crime, any small rise in crime, which raises the perception of the dangers of crime, is like kryptonite to all forms of progressive government, and not just a crime policy, everything. To a great extent, the conservative turn in American politics in the last quarter of the 20th century was, all sorts of roots, but what really drove it was crime politics. Other things too, but it takes everything else with it. And one of the things that is so striking to me is, before the pandemic, there may not have been a great deal of progress at the federal level, but at least in terms of rhetoric, even a lot of Republicans were like, "Oh, well, obviously we need, kind of, uh, 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 um, I'm forgetting the phrase used, but basically lowering sentences, you know, letting people out of long jail terms and all that thing that was happening before the pandemic. And as we can see, um, that can change really fast, really, really fast. And to your point, I've always been really interested in the causes of violent crime, particularly murder, and the politics around it, because murder is the ultimate crime
Hmm.
for reasons that are obvious. Not only because it is the most fundamental crime, but it is the least. It is the crime that is least uh, subject to the variances of reporting. When someone dies, they die. They're gone. You don't. Something happened to them, right? Even if you can't find the body, someone disappeared. We know that historically, rape and sex-based crimes are very, very frequently not reported, or they're reported and they're not prosecuted. So the rates of sexual crimes are the numbers are hard to make sense of. Even things like theft, not everything is reported, blah 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 blah. So murder is the cardinal crime. And I've been very focused on crime rates in New York City, just because I've always been, it's where I live. It's kind of so much of late 20th century was on the sort of the mythic status of New York City being out of control. And it is true that murder rates went up a bit during the first year of the pandemic, and then they stabilized and they've basically come down. And that is pretty much the case around the country, in the sense of there was a jump that didn't get you remotely as high as, like, the 1980s, early 1990s, but there was a jump and then stabilized, and most places going back down. But the caveat to that is that there are a lot of crimes like carjacking, just break-ins to store. There's larceny is the term, but basically just kind of theft, certain kinds of theft, not burglary, but just people breaking into stores. People, this kind of mass shoplifting where a group of people will descend on a store, blah 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 blah. So that that has a big effect on perceptions. And certainly if your stuff gets stolen, it's very upsetting, right? Anybody who's ever had anything stolen, it feels like a violation and all that kind of stuff. But as you say, the actual crime rate is complicated right now. And I think it's largely tied to just, it's sort of like one of those snow globe things, right? Someone took our whole society and just shook it up, and everything got really weird. And I'm not sure I'm a pessimist about this. I guess I'd say I'm a realist, that when people feel insecure, insecure in that sense, I'm
Hmm.
unsafe. Um, the political ramifications of that are going to be really bad. And it's really important to focus on doing things to change the roots of that. Even you are just never going to get very far politically saying, look, people are not really being killed more than they were. Larceny is up, and carjacking is up, but break-ins in the homes are not. People, they want none, right? They want it all to be going down. And having said that, I think we have seen that just upping jail sentences is not really the most effective way to change that. Some, but I'll tell you some very basic things that, you know, support for capital punishment is at historic lows. It
Mm-hmm.
still is, even with everything that's happened in the last few years. Um, but I pretty much guarantee you, if we went back to crime rates the 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 way they were in the late 70s and 80s and early 90s, it would go back up. And as someone who doesn't believe in capital punishment, that's a reason to really think creatively about public safety. And it goes way beyond just incarceration and capital punishment and um, all of the ways that Black Americans and non-white Americans take the brunt of heightened law
Mm-hmm.
enforcement. Um, it really is up to progressives to come up with creative ways to ensure public safety, because without it, all progressive government kind of quickly goes by the wayside. And that's what I mean by sort of, I'm not sure it's a pessimist, being a realist. That's just a fact. And you're not going to, if people feel insecure, you're not going to convince them that showing them some statistics, it's not as bad as you think. It's just, I mean, it's not like the people who were against mass incarceration in the 70s and 80s just kind of were dumb, right? Or who were against capital punishment. It's like impossible. So anyway, sort of a bit of a down note there. Any other thoughts on that before we wrap up?
No, I think that's all right. And I think, there's not going to be any space for kind of progressive creativity about public safety stuff while Democrats are just so like afraid of what Republicans are going to say about them here because they're always going to say that, right? And we've seen that kind of doing the same thing is not going to work. So the options are stark, but based on this, I don't know, kind of capitulation, it just doesn't. I don't know. I wish I had something more hopeful to say, but this episode doesn't give you a lot of faith that Democrats are kind of going to split away from their stepping into Republicans' line that they've been doing for, recent history.
Well, I would say this. I do think, one of the things that I think was bad, that was strategically and substantively bad about a lot of the response to what happened during the pandemic, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, um, the kind of the talk of defund the police is, you can spend more money on non-armed public safety. When you've got someone in a mental health crisis, you don't have to send a bunch of sort of like, amped up 30-year-old men with guns. A lot of time that is not going to end well. And I think that there is a lot that even police would support,
Mm-hmm.
and that would uh, end up with a lot fewer tragic outcomes if you say, let's set aside this whole, like, not just defunding the police, but cutting police budgets, all this kind of stuff, making it a zero sum. Maybe it should be a zero sum, but it's not a good political zero sum, and you're going to lose those debates. This is kind of my point about progressives need to be creative about how you ensure public safety, right? Because again, as much as they say they're against it, high crime rates are great for conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
It means they're all going to get elected. So, and that is a case where, again, set aside taking money from police budgets, at least at first. Try funding other stuff that actually can move the ball. And again, I think it was just a substantively and strategically understandable, perhaps. We're still living in crazy times, and 2020 was the craziest of times. But again, making it that zero sum. We're going to take money from the police, give it to these kind of, counselor first responders, which can easily be pilloried as, oh, we're going to give it to some social worker who's going to show up during the bank robbery and find out about the deep causes of why they went to a life of crime and stuff. Again, don't make it either or, because it if you get out of if you move away from the aggressively politicized stuff, there's always been a constituency among cops for, don't send us when someone is like having a breakdown. We're not trained for that, you know. So anyway, it really is. It may not be fair, but it behooves progressives to be creative and smart about how you ensure public safety, because without it, you might as well go back to like 1979 and like just agree only to elect Republicans.
All right.
So, on that note, let me remind everybody the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off your order if you go to Grady'sColdBrew.com and use the promo code TPM. And you can, of course, buy Grady's at all your better supermarket and grocery establishments. So,
all right. See you
that's
next
it.
week.
See you next week.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.